All right, so today we are moving on to the study of learning. Learning is one of those areas in psychology that means a lot to psychologists. So when people in general talk about learning, they can mean a whole plethora of things. But in psychology, learning, particularly to those of us who are a little bit older, like invokes a historical time in psychology where there was a group of researchers that kind of held psychology in their almost literal iron grip. It was very, very conservative time in psychology. So people are, when you start talking about learning, like, I don't really want to talk about that. That wasn't so nice. But it's a very important area in psychology. And somewhat ironically, some of the most positive, beneficial things that we do in psychology have come out of learning theory. So that is a little bit of the kind of baggage of learning theory, so to speak. Come on now, boy. What's your problem? That was nice. I did all the right things. No? All right, let's do this. Let's try this. You come out of there, you go in there. All right. So what is learning? But when we talk about learning amongst ourselves, of course, learning might bring up to you initially, a kindergarten classroom. Okay? People learn things in kindergarten classrooms, and we like that to be a nice, efficient process, one that's supportive, maybe even inspires you to learn in a kind of lifelong kind of way. Right? So learning, even within psychology, we'd like to be able to have our theories of learning encompass phenomena like what's happening in the classroom. All right, this is just a loser for today, I guess. I don't know what's going on. Time? I don't know what's happening. But we'd also like to have things like, see if that works. Just put this down so I stop using it. I guess that's gonna be worth today. We'd also like phenomena like teaching your dog how to do good dog behaviors. Right? Very important to train your dog, by the way, if you ever get a dog. Maybe you already have had a dog. Dog learning, very difficult to pull off. Mostly what dogs do is teach you how to be a bad dog owner, if given their druthers. Right, so they will teach you, like, oh, now's the time that I need to get up. So why don't you get up too? I'd like to do it this way. And you actually will mold to them rather than the other way around. So go to a dog trainer. The dog trainer will employ the laws of learning that have been discovered through all the psychology stuff we're going to tell you about, but they know it in a practical way. So even someone like me, who's very familiar with these laws of learning, I just get trained by the dog too. Right? So you want a professional who knows how to deploy these laws. But we want learning theory to explain how you're able to train your dog. We'd also like learning theory to reach kind of outside of our species interactions and be able to handle things like how a monkey mother and a monkey baby interact so that the baby learns new things about how to survive in its environment. So that also seems like it's within the realm of learning. But you can see now that maybe we're drifting a little bit into things which might be a little bit more about developmental psychology, a little bit less about like pure learning. Some people in psychology like to draw the line here, but others say, well, maybe what's happening in learning should also extend to species that are much, much further away from us, phylogenetically speaking, like the sea anemone. Maybe this creature should also be able to learn, and that learning somehow is similar to what we go through as humans or in higher order primates. Maybe even we should be able to extend it to things like slime molds, because they too seem to have the ability to kind of adapt to their environment in a way that's dependent on experience. So you can see that maybe all of this way of considering learning is kind of driving us to a big definition. That's what we want when we talk about learning, is to be able to theoretically explain, right, supported by a bunch of evidence, a relatively permanent change in your knowledge, mostly reserved for humans, hard to assess knowledge for other creatures, and behavior that comes through experience. So that's the big question, right? How can we explain how experience has a long-term impact on you? Right? It's kind of weird to think about experience doing that because you have a lot of experiences. And even just sitting here, you think about each individual thing that you could pull out as a strand. Oh yeah, you know, that person just put their hair. So why aren't you focused on that as a learning experience? Why doesn't that like change you permanently? On the other hand, hopefully, when I put up the definition, you're going, oh, that's something that needs to be learned. Let me write that shit down. Right? But somehow your system does that. I mean, obviously, this is a directed learning environment. Like you are, like all boys, take stuff off of you. But it happens all the time. There's certain things where you will pull off the right thing to learn about and ignore all the background, all the stuff that's kind of coming along at the same time. So somehow your system is really good at doing that. And boy, that has bothered philosophers and scientists for years and years and years. Philosophers especially. Scientists, we just tend to like just drive the truck right over that. One way to solve this problem, right, the problem of how do you know what it is you're supposed to learn, is to simply say, well, learning, it's an illusion. There's no such thing. There is no learning at all. All there is an unfolding of knowledge that you already possess. So this is a classic nativist argument. Maybe that word and that argument sounds familiar, right? So nativism, the idea that everything, or almost everything maybe, hard to get anybody to say everything, almost everything that you know, you already know. Everything you're going to know, I should say, you already know. And you're just kind of being triggered into discovering it. So grammar and language, for example, is already in you. When you hear this language, you go through and you set some switches up and you have something like English grammar. But the deep knowledge of grammar travels with you across generations. One explanation. This bothered Plato so much that he came up with this thing called reminiscence theory, which sounds maybe silly to us now from a scientific basis. We don't usually think about things like the soul as entering into scientific discourse, right? But get rid of the soul and the rest of it sound very current. To know is to remember the experiences that the soul had before it entered the body. Now, obviously, this is kind of part of a bigger theory about how your soul and your body and coming together and the longevity of your soul relative to your body. So we don't have to talk about that. But the idea that you couldn't learn anything was part of what was driving this. Right? And he was so bothered by learning that this theory seemed right. I need a theory that says you can't actually learn anything. Rather, everything is already traveling with you, essentially. In this case, kind of bonded to your soul somehow. So that's one kind of pole position. We'll blame it on Plato. You can blame a lot of things on Plato because he said almost everything there was to say that was interesting. The opposing position we're going to blame on John Locke. A little bit unfair. He didn't really quite say any of this, but this is how certain figures in history become iconic, better or for worse, and so poor Locke is one of them. So we blame Locke with this idea we've probably heard of before, called the tabula rasa, or the blank slate. And this is a pure, strong, probably straw person position, which says everything you learn everything you learn is by experience. And so he proposes rather that it's like a huge associative system, and you are somehow, doesn't explain how, but you're somehow putting together everything. All the experiences kind of add up to an understanding of reality. Initially, to quote a different person, it's, excuse me, a booming, buzzing confusion, and eventually the structure in it gets detected by the network. Now, really using more modern terminology, right? And that's learning, and then it learns and learns and learns. So that's the other position. Everything is experience, really nothing, and nothing in the realm of ideas or thoughts is driven by prior knowledge. Okay, so two polar opposites. So there is a lot of back and forth between these two sides. Still, you just think it's going to go away. You think you have it solved. You think we've agreed on what reality looks like, and they just, somebody takes off in one direction or the other. So while no one is actually defending reminiscence theory in the literature at the moment, it's very much like reminiscence theory in how it's kind of dealt with historically. So, big issues in learning. Let's talk about some particular learning processes. So people tried to get learning into the lab and tried to make a typology of learning, right? So that we wanted to say, there's this kind of learning, and there's that kind of learning, there's this kind of learning, there's that kind of learning. And they each one have kind of their own structure to them. Okay, so that's what we mean when we talk about learning processes. They've tried to identify different forms of learning. One of the simplest is called habituation. Just like it sounds like, it is the process of essentially having your system, your responsive system, become familiar with and therefore kind of bored with whatever stimulation you're getting. It's called habituation, right? So habit being the kind of the nice root word there. So we have a decrease in response over repeated exposure to the same stimuli or stimuli of that type. So initially, something happens and you respond really strongly. And then over time, right, the next time it happens, maybe a little bit less, and then a little bit less, until you're not really responding at all, in theory at least. That first exposure tends to trigger something that we call an orienting reflex, because we needed to name it something. So we call it an orienting reflex. So something loud and obnoxious happens, right? So a bang, and you're, oh, what's that? That's an orienting reflex. Or a bright light, right? Some sudden change in the environment. So habituation, not the orienting reflex. Sorry, I realize that might not be clear in the way this is laid out. So habituation is this primitive form of learning. Orienting reflex is reflexive. There's no learning involved. You're set up that way already. Okay. It's a reflexive response. But habituation is a primitive form of learning. Again, to this single stimulus. So this initially reflexive behavior, as we say above, diminishes with subsequent exposure. Okay, so here's an example. Yeah, well, it's pretty obnoxious. So let me just here. I'll tell you what. Rather than do that, dude, how come you're not letting me do that? All right. Well, we'll see what happens. Oh, it's going to be loud. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so obviously the stimuli here, that's getting that orienting reflex is that loud banging noise, right? So bang, yes.
Is this related to sensory adaptation?
Is it related to sensory adaptation? So that is a great question. So sensory adaptation and habituation, anytime you roll out sensory adaptation or habituation, somebody who is studying the other thing says, isn't that the thing I'm studying? Because they are two different things. So sensory adaptation tends to not involve an orienting reflex as much. And the sort of the mechanism is supposed to be local and sensory. Like it's literally supposed to be your sensory organs. This is supposed to be like a deeper learning process where the creature has been like, has learned that this particular stimulus doesn't require a big response, right? So it's not that they're not, that the sensory system doesn't detect it. It's just that they no longer respond to it. They're supposed to be different problems. Great point. Okay, so everybody's, so you can kind of, it's a beautiful demonstration of, right? And that's a classic, by the way, completely classic, like learning response chamber for a rat. So here's what it looks like. Trials here, and then the strength of the startle response, which in a situation like this, you could do from the video. Usually they actually have like a force plate in the chamber itself. So that little jerkiness that they're getting is actually creates a force on the plate, which you can nicely measure, right? So that's a nicety about it. But you can see generally what's happening. We have a really strong response, and then generally less and less and less response. So in a way, the animal is, for whatever reason, becoming bored. They have learned that this stimulus does not merit a response. Okay, so that's habituation. Pretty easy to get. You can get it with almost, it's a little bit more, but almost any living creature will give you habituation. We also have a little bit more interesting, certainly a little bit more useful from a psychology standpoint, process called dishabituation. Dishabituation is the recovery of the response to the original stimulus, but first you have to be habituated. So you're habituated, right? You have the banging noise, and you've already now decided that that is not interesting enough to respond to. And then either some time elapses, or the context changes, or maybe the stimulus changes a little bit, you see a dishabituation response. All right, so we have habituation to an original stimulus. Then we either change the stimulus or the context. Again, you can also just have enough time go by. Right. We then have presentation of the original stimulus again, and the response is restored to be officially, well, that's not really true. Anyway, that's fine, good enough. So here we have our habituated rat. Now they've, in this case, they've hit the rat with another stimulus. It's kind of the same, right? It's auditory, but it's different. Right? And now they go back to the original, and the original gets a response again. So there are only about a million different ways, a million different combinations to this. This is one way to do it. Okay, so this is meant to show that the animal indeed is habituated first. Right, so we have that low level of responding, and there would be, prior to this, of course, that down curve would be here. You with me? So the one we just looked at, right? So this is kind of an extension of that previous graph, if you will. And then something happens. In this case, it's another stimulus, right? It's kind of in the same domain, auditory stimulus of a kind of loud and obnoxious kind. And it gets a response because it's different enough. We then, in this particular case, we give them another shot of this original stimulus, right? And interestingly, they respond to it. Right? So somehow it's like they get a reset from this extraneous stimulus, and then things go back down. So this has been used, this tiny little thing has been used with great effect with babies to show that they can indeed discriminate one thing from another. And they have turned that into like a huge industry. It's like babies can do this, babies can do that, all based on habituation, dishabituation kind of setups, very much like this. And so this is one of the simplest forms of learning. Questions on all that? So this one's pretty easy, I think. Sometimes people get confused between habituation and dishabituation. There's kind of a logical connection between habituation having to happen before you can get dishabituation. That's maybe a little bit odd. Another place that confusion happens is that like what this change is can vary quite a bit. Okay, so something in the stimulus or the context has to change to get you to do the dishabituation. Okay. All right. Shall I go on? I'll go on. Right. So that's useful, right? As I said, been used with infants, been used in a lot of different paradigms. Very nice, very reliable. Lots and lots of creatures do it. Doesn't feel very learning like though, right? It's not like the sort of learning that you're doing in the classroom or when you're learning to drive or anything, you know. In fact, you don't really want to habituate too much when you're driving, by the way. Clearly. Oh, another car. Yeah, that's not kidding. The last one wasn't important. Maybe this one isn't either, right? That's not a good plan. And interestingly, it doesn't happen to everything, right? It only happens to some things, right? If you habituated to everything, you'd be in a lot of trouble because things are kind of the same for long stretches of time, and it's important to stay alert. So that it has sort of a limited usefulness. Association, on the other hand, is gigantic in its implication. Right? So people in psychology love association. It seems like it is going to be one of our major explanatory ideas, that one thing is somehow connected to another thing. And those things could be ideas. In a way, I guess they could always be ideas because anything that you perceive in the environment can kind of, at least in theory, be turned into an idea mentally. And then those things can communicate with each other. So that idea of connection is something that psychology gets very excited about. So we can take this all the way back to Aristotle, who pretty much said all there was to say about association. We could probably just stop with him. He got it pretty much all right. I mean, if you read Aristotle, you know that. It's 350 BC. How did you come up with all this crap? But he, without any experimentation, no rats, no cages, no flings, no bangs, nothing, he comes up with these laws of association. So one law is the law of contiguity. So law of contiguity says that two things that occur contiguous with each other, either in time or space, will be associated. Two things that occur contiguous with each other, that is, in time or space, closely connected, temporally or spatially, will be associated. The law of contiguity. Works? Great. Still works. People still talk about it. Many people have claimed that they discovered it, right? All the way back to Aristotle. The law of similarity is that when two things are similar, one thing will elicit the other through association. So here is my water drinking cup. It is similar to another water drinking cup that I used to have. Not that similar, but a little bit similar for me. And that similarity can make me spontaneously think about that. Right? Or I can think about the similarity of the water that can to other liquids. So the water being similar brings up for me all other liquids. Not complicated, right? You would, you know, your grandmother would go, yeah, that's probably about right. My lifetime experience, yes, something like that. On the other side of that, and maybe now it's going to make things feel a little fishy, we have contrast, which is the polar opposite of similarity. So when things are very different one from another, that also is supposed to bring up it's sort of call up its opposite number, right? So it's really cold outside, not really today, but it would say it's really cold outside, and that brings up days when it's really hot, by contrast. So I am eating in a restaurant and it's miserable. The food is awful. And that brings up by contrast the last time I went to Trigo. Ever been to Trigo? You ever been to Trigo? Down in Willimantic? Oh, it's really good. Trigo. Fantastic pizza. Right? So every time I go to bad pizza, I think, oh man, this isn't Trigo. Right? So that's the idea. But you can see why I'm kind of like, well, hold on now. You have both things that are similar, both things that are contrastive, and they both do the same thing. That seems a little bit, is there any room in the middle? Well, I guess there is, but not so sure. And then finally, there's frequency, which was kind of a tack on later, but also works really well. This just says that the more things occur together, the more likely they are to be associated. Right? So the more things occur together, the more, in your experience, the more likely they are to be associated. So that is another super sensible one. And those work, again, really, really well. Okay, so these are, for our purposes, 4 laws of association that Aristotle is proposing. This fellow, David Hume, right? Can you imagine being on the same slide with Aristotle? Like that. Maybe I should just aim for being on the same slide with David Hume. That would probably be good enough for me. But this guy was a very famous philosopher, and he kind of agreed with Aristotle for the most part, and then just kind of turned things into slightly different terms, with one exception. So he got rid of some of it. You can see he kept contiguity. Good idea, because that works really well. He kept similarity, but renamed it resemblance. Similarity and resemblance are just synonyms, so same thing. Then he imported this other thing, radical. Causation. Causation? What the heck? Right? Right? That should really bother you, right? The other things are just like, that we've described so far, like things you can just tick off in the environment, right? Frequency, no problem, I just gotta count. All right, similarity. Well, now I have to have some metric for similarity, but it doesn't seem insurmountable. Right. Contiguity, well, that was just about things being kind of together, easy peasy. But causation, it's like a Pandora's box of problems. How do you know what causes what? And you know that before the things are associated? What? Anyway, there it is. So his argument was that things that you perceive as being causative, the cause and the effect become associated. Okay, so the cause and the effect become associated. You perceive them to be causal, cause and effect become associated. Okay. Without explaining how anybody ever perceives anything as causal, which is a whole nother kettle of fish, and why it doesn't involve associations, I don't know. But that's the idea. Okay, questions about all that? Yes. Sure. So remember that what we're trying to do is we're trying to explain why people pick out particular elements in the world, right? And think about them as associated. So if you see me walk up to the chair and move the chair, I have now caused the chair to move. Now I, according to Hume, am associated with the chair through that causal relationship. Okay. Or the sun, in theory, causes a tree to grow. When I say tree, you should think, oh, sun. Or when I say sun, you should think, that's that tree growing causation thing. Okay. So very simple things like that. The other side of it, of course, is that things that aren't causal, but happen at the same time, are less likely to be associated. Right, so if I'm walking, right, and one of you is walking, going the other way, we are moving at the same time, but we aren't interfering with each other, then you're not likely to say, oh, me and that person are related in some way. That association sort of isn't built because there's a lack of causation. You can kind of see what he's trying to pick out, that you are sensitive to causation, and that gets put away as association. Yeah. So the question is, are these theories in agreement with each other? To the extent that they're theories, they're mostly in agreement, except that Hume is kind of rejecting, obviously, the contrast and the frequency arguments of Aristotle, right? And Aristotle, if he weren't long dead, would have said, yeah, this causation thing, you got a lot of explaining to do, young man. Right? He would not have been quite so happy with that. So yeah, so there's disagreement and there's agreement. Okay, so association has been around obviously a very, very long time, and people have tried to kind of get at it in multiple ways. And much of what we're going to talk about throughout the rest of the learning is essentially trying to get at different forms of association. Right? How could we explain association? For whatever reason. So accidentally, really, a group of Russian scientists fell upon association in the Latin. And that started this whole movement to try to get association kind of back in all that. Now, people had tried other times, but these guys happened to run into a paradigm where association just suddenly showed up. Okay. This is going to give the kind of the roots to this idea that we sometimes call behaviorism, which is there are behaviorists, there are very few left. But for a while it was huge. It's a form of radical empiricism, by which we mean the John Lockean, tabula rasa, everything comes from experience viewpoint. They were radically focused on behavior and behavior alone. All the stuff of your mind, ideas, concepts, all that stuff was not to be put on the scientific table. So that was all illegal from their point of view. It couldn't be measured. So I don't know what you're talking about concepts for. There's no such thing that I can put a meter on. So they only want to talk about behavior and things happening in the environment. And everything in between is, you can't speculate about it. Okay, so that's kind of this general approach. And you can see that, for lots of psychology, that's going to kind of outlaw their main stuff. All right, so memory, hold on. All right, and then all sorts of things where, like, you want to try to help somebody practically with psychology. Well, all you could do, according to them, was worry about their behavior and worry about their environmental structure. Everything else off the table. So that's one way to try to study learning. Later on, and we'll get to these guys eventually, we're going to talk about this cognitive approach, which kind of a form of rationalism in that they inject the mind with reason, assume that everything follows the laws of logic, more or less, and now allows mental experience into the picture, and in a way, improve things, and in another way, ruin the whole. So you'll see, it becomes, there's so much that can be in there now. Anyway, but I won't tell you that. I'm ruining the end of the story. Let's go back to the beginning of the story with a bunch of Russians who stumbled upon associations accidentally. So this is going to be classical conditioning. And it was developed by and eventually embraced by this fellow, Ivan Pavlov. You've probably heard about him. Pavlov's dogs. Right? It's a fantastic story. This guy won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1904 for work on physiology of digestion. He shows up to give his Nobel address, as people do. You can actually look at all the Nobel addresses if you like to, they're all online. Very interesting stuff. So he gets up, right? He goes, he's going to deliver his address, right? Blah, blah, blah. And he starts talking about classical conditioning, which is not what he won for. Right? He won for like some details of the physiology. He had studied very thoroughly and you know, addressed the field. But hey, I discovered something new. I want to tell you about it. Well, the thing that he's describing here is classical conditioning. So originally, his group is studying salivation, which is different from salvation, rather radically different, actually. So salivation, right? Kind of gross. It's the process of producing saliva in your mouth. Your digestive system kind of comes on, produces stuff in order to deal with the fact that you're about to have some ingestible that's going to end up in your gut and needs to be broken down through mechanical and chemical processes. Okay? So it's important. He studied this with dogs, and the dogs were not put in a particularly nice setup. You know, being dogs, they probably were okay with it, but they often had tubes stuck up into their salivary glands. Doesn't sound very comfortable. To collect the saliva. And what they did to have the dog salivate is they presented them with food powder. Right? Usually the food powder is like a controlled way to do it. So the food powder, they would kind of blow into their mouths, and then the dogs would salivate. Right? And this, again, it was the salivation, it's chemical makeup it's on, which is what they were most interested in. But it started to happen that they were getting these things they called psychic secretions. So a psychic, the hell is that? Psychic secretion. That sounds like something out of a movie. So psychic secretions for them were the anticipatory secretions before you blew the food powder in. All right, so along would come the assistant. They're gonna, run trial number 27, right? Goes to blow the food powder into the dog's mouth. The dog's very sick. What the hell? Did you eat something? Oh no, the dog hasn't, right? The dog carefully controls. So there's something about the dog knowing what's about to happen that's messing up the experiment. So this, Pavlov starts to realize, is really strange, because the whole theory of salivation is that there's like a mechanical trigger, right? A mechanical trigger. The presence of the actual food stuff is what makes salivation happen. You with me? And so we go presence of the food stuff, right? Just like the kind of sensory stuff we've been talking about. So now I have a little gustatory event inside the receptors of my mouth, right? To the salivation process. That's the story. That's what happens. But what he's finding is that that's happening in the absence of the sensory stuff. See the problem? Like, hold it now. So first of all, they're like, well, this sucks. Because I was going to stimulate you with thing X. Right? And then later thing Y. And what I'm getting is before I even present anything to you, you're salivating out. For me. Maybe not quite on, but you see what I mean? Right? So it's a problem. And Pavlov is very bright, and he goes, hold it, this isn't just a problem, this is an opportunity. Because what I'm finding is a physiological response that is being triggered by outside of the system, physiological system, at least events. It's a form of learning. And so that becomes classical conditioning. So it takes this non-meaningful relationship, unmeaningful relationship, if you will, and somehow makes assigns a meaning to it. So what's the relationship? Well, the relationship is something like, on the occasion that I put into this apparatus and have things stuck into my face, right, into my salivary glands, and along comes the nice assistant with that yummy powder, it's time to eat. Right, so that situation now takes on a meaning that it didn't have before, right? The approach of somebody didn't make them salivate until they had the experience enough times that they learned that it was going to mean something. Feel me? So that's the learning aspect of it. This, just to point it out, is an example of the law of contiguity. Associations formed among conditions that are closely related in time. The condition of the approach of the individual, perhaps, in this situation, and the food powder are related in really space and time. They're contiguous and we learn. Right? So classical conditioning is an example of the law of contiguity. Okay, so that's my big sales job on classical conditioning. Now things are going to get a little bit technical and a little bit confusing. And I apologize for the terminology. I didn't make this up. They didn't ask me whether these were good terms or not. Okay. They are confusing terms. So you're feeling all relaxed. That's great. Now you're going to want to note, you're going to want to be very careful about these next 4 terms. Really suck. Okay. You've been warned. I'll warn you again in a minute. So here we go. These things they sound alike, and their intuitiveness, it ain't so great. The first one we'll call the unconditioned response. So before conditioning, we would hopefully all agree, certainly this is what Pavlov was expecting, there's a not to be explained natural relationship between the presentation of the food powder and the event of salivation. Right? Okay. Right? Put some in my mouth, I salivate. Good job. Eventually, we are going to introduce, we're going to kind of formalize the thing rather than just have it be the approach of the person. We're going to ring a bell with the presentation of the food powder. Right? But we would agree that the presentation of the bell wouldn't get any salivation response, right? Or you don't go ding, 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 oh, yummy bells, right? That's not going to work. Right? So the bell is supposed to be this kind of neutral stimulus. It doesn't get a response. Okay, so here we go. The food is we're going to call it the unconditioned stimulus. That's what US means. Unconditioned stimulus. U is always unconditioned. The salivation is an unconditioned response. See that counterintuitiveness of it a little bit? Unconditioned. So it's not learned. That's what we mean by unconditioned. So we now we're just restated the relationship here with the food presentation, unconditioned stimulus, salivation, unconditioned response. Okay, so it would go like this. Food, it actually wasn't so nice. Can you imagine they gave them a nice steak every time with peppercorns? It'd be lovely. So some food, right, which would get the dog's interest for certain, right? And then the dog responds, and this dog eating the salivating a little bit, isn't that great? Right? So food gets the response of salivation, unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Okay? Remember, you will need this as a touchstone later as we get other things into the same framework. You're like, oh, that's like the food. That's like the bell, right? Even people who have done this for a long time still have this as the touchstone. Okay, so far, nothing interesting has happened. We just have a salivating dog salivating to food. Okay, but, God, it's so corny, it's just terrible. All right, but if we have a bell, okay, alone, no food, no nothing, the dog is not interested in that. Probably doesn't sleep through the bell. Maybe they do, but they certainly don't salivate. Okay, so this is eventually going to become, it is the potential, given what we're going to do, conditioned stimulus. And eventually, we're going to make the dog salivate to that. And when they do, we're going to call that the conditioned response, when it's in response to the conditioned stimulus. Okay, you kind of get the parallel, unconditioned and conditioned. Stimulus, response. Okay, so here we go. Hopefully this isn't going to ring again. Here's the now going to be, what is it going to be? See, it's hard. You right? Go ahead. Okay, it's going to be eventually the conditioned stimulus. It's not quite yet because we haven't done the conditioning yet. Where you're going to pair it with this guy, okay, which is the unconditioned stimulus. We're going to pair those two, and the dog is going to respond in this unconditioned way. So the dog is going to salivate. At this moment, it's still an unconditioned response because the response is entirely to this guy, not to that guy. And we're going to do that over and over again. You with me? So, and it's this pairing, this contiguity between the bell and the food that is the learning. Right? It's learning that this is presented with that. Right? This guy, right, is just a natural relationship. And what's going to happen is this pairing now, right, this contiguity is going to kind of ride on this onto this relationship. So now what's going to happen is we're going to present the bell alone without the food. And if we do that after enough pairing trials, we get the what is now conditioned response of salivation. Okay, so this neutral stimulus, the bell, which we're calling now the conditioned stimulus, evokes the response. So the conditioned stimulus, sometimes called the CS, gets us now the conditioned response, which is, again, this is one of those little awkward things, the same as the unconditioned response. It's also salivation, even in the absence of the original unconditioned stimulus. Okay, questions before I let you go? Go ahead.
Say like you teach it on like say everything teaches give it tree. It's like the same thing that makes us so slow.
Yeah. So the question is, if you were to train a dog to sit and then reward the dog with a treat after every time they did so, is that the same kind of structure? It turns out that's a little bit different. That's a form of operant conditioning, and we'll get to that eventually. Okay, so review these terms for yourself, kind of get them firmed up. Should be in the book. You know, the presentation in the book is pretty good. Okay, and we can start next time if you have questions.